He's an anthropologist and currently the assistant professor of international studies at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, British Columbia. He is the author of In the Camps, China's High-Tech Penal Colony, and an ethnographic monograph titled Terror Capitalism, Uyghur Dispossession and Masculinity in a Chinese City. He's also the co-translator of The Back Streets by Perhat Tursun, the first Uyghur language novel to be published into English. His current research interests are focused on policing and carceral theory, infrastructure development, and global China. All right, so thank you very much for joining us, Professor Byler. I will hand it off to you now.
Thank you so much, Eureka. Thank you, Sylvia, and everyone else who helped to organize this, and all of you for coming. Oh, I forgot to hold up the books as you were talking about them. I told them I would get them. They're right here. They might look in reverse to you. I'm not sure. But I think this book in particular, the shorter book, it's just 35,000 words, would be something that would be really useful in the classroom. And this novel too, I think, could be a useful teaching tool. But I'll mostly be talking about that red book. Let me share my screen and we'll get started. Okay. So what I'll be talking about today is my fieldwork in Northwest China, in Xinjiang, and how it is related to what in China is referred to as the People's War on Terror, but more broadly to counterterrorism, to the global war on terror, and some of the tools of counterterrorism, or surveillance, and how they're can be connected to Islamophobia. And then in the specifics of the Xinjiang case, how this is connected to a system of unfree or forced labor, and also family separation. So a lot of really heavy topics here, but I think important not to look away from. And so that's what we'll try to do. So this short book titled In the Camps, China's High-Tech Penal Colony is published through Columbia Global Reports, which is an imprint of the Columbia Journalism School. So it's really a kind of long form journalism in the style of the New Yorker. At least that was the aspiration. The editor for the book is a New Yorker staff writer. And what it does is it draws on 26 months of field research in Xinjiang, the Uyghur Autonomous Region in Northwest China, and also research and interviews in Kazakhstan, which is just right across the border from Xinjiang. The sort of bulk or the main driver of the narrative of the book centers around interviews with 15 former detainees, people that were held in these camps or worked in the camps as teachers, as low-level security officers, and who could really sort of speak to the mundane, everyday aspects of what it was like to live inside this system, the goals of this system, and so on. Most of those folks were people that I interviewed in Kazakhstan, Kazakh people that, because of their relationship to family members living in Kazakhstan and to the Kazakhstani government, were able to be released from the camps and also then allowed to leave the country. And so they're in relative safety, able to speak about what they experience. One of them, though, is a current University of Washington student named Vera Zhou. Well, actually, she probably just graduated. I should actually, she may or may not have graduated already. She's very close to graduating in any case, but she lives in the Pacific Northwest, and is someone who I got to know through her mother after she was detained, and then through repeated interviews with her after she came back. And so the book actually starts with her story and it ends with her story, thinking about how Seattle figures in this story that actually seems to happen far away, but is connected to North America. Another important source of information in the book is interviews with family members of detainees. Many of those, again, I interviewed in Kazakhstan, some of whom were living in the region until just months before I interviewed them. And so they could really speak to what had happened, what they had experienced from outside of the camp systems. I'm also trying to understand, like, how do the camps kind of seep into all aspects of life? And I was also able to corroborate things that I saw during my last visit to the region, which was in 2018, after hundreds of thousands of people had already been detained. Going through checkpoints and observing how they were scanning people, scanning their phones, scanning their faces, scanning their IDs, and then talking to these people who are coming across the border about that experience. And so I can kind of corroborate things that I observed but couldn't ask people about while I was there. Another thing that I draw on in the book is interviews with people that worked inside the camps or prisons, low-level workers. And when I was there the last time in 2018, I interviewed around a dozen Han surveillance workers, people that had been sent to go live in Uyghur and Kazakh homes, often the homes of people who are missing someone in the camps and who are therefore deemed sort of sensitive and needed to be monitored. And so that also kind of helps me to understand both the sort of the victim's experience, but also the perpetrator's experience, the low-level perpetrators, and how a system of coercion really begins to shape all aspects of life and make it hard to say no to participating in the system. Another thing that I draw on is internal police files. I've been working with a journal called The Intercept, which obtained hundreds of thousands of internal police files through a contractor who had been servicing and helping to build the mobile policing network in the capital city of the region. And these are very detailed police reports from like daily and weekly checkpoints that really speak to the numbers of people detained, the goals and capacities of the system. Then, of course, there's lots of open source government documents and other classified documents too that help to kind of corroborate the qualitative sources of interview-based material. So that's just a bit about my methods, what goes into this book. A lot of this material is cited at the end of the book. And so, if students are interested, you can look at the primary source documents. A lot of them are in Chinese. But there, some of them are available, or you can use Google Translate to figure out sort of what's being said. Anyway, that's just to say that I'm not making this stuff up. Where in the world are we? What's going on in China? So one of the things I want to kind of convey through my talk today is the diversity of China. And sort of the frontiers of China as well, and ways of thinking about it as a colonial frontier. So this is a map that is mapping out the ethno-linguistic homelands of different groups of people in China. There's 56 ethnic groups in China, according to the state. Many of them are in Southwest China, but then there's larger groups like the Tibetans who live here, and Mongols who live up here, and then the Turkic peoples here. And the Tibetans, Turkic peoples like Uyghurs and Kazakhs, and Mongols are important groups because they are large minorities with 4 to 5 million in the case of the Tibetans. In the case of the Uyghurs, as many as 12 million. The Uyghurs is one of the largest minority groups. And they inhabit ancestral homelands that are quite large as well. If we look at these lands on their own, it's around a third of the landmass of China, or the landmass claimed by China. The darker green area is the ancestral homelands of the Han people, which is the majority group, so 1.3 or so billion people. But since like in the 19th and 20th century, but particularly since 1949, which is when the People's Republic of China was founded, these areas have been increasingly claimed by the Han majority group. Han people have moved into them, which makes them a kind of internal settler colony of the state. They're in a similar position to the way Alaska, which is the land of First Nations peoples, has been claimed by the United States as part of the United States, and through infrastructure building, pipelines, and so on, has become the site of a internal settler colonization. North America itself is a settler colony. I'm sure you're aware of this. So how did this happen in the Uyghur case in particular? Well, there was a population that were moved into this part of Northwest China already in the 1950s to secure the borderland and also relieve population pressure elsewhere in China, and securing it against the supposed threat of the Soviet Union, because this part of China at that point, it wasn't really clear if it would become part of the Soviet Union or if it would remain part of China or become part of China. And so Stalin, you can find these transcripts of Stalin talking to the Chinese Communist Party leadership in the 1940s, saying, you must occupy this space, otherwise the Muslims might just regain control of it. And also they might become allied with the British Empire, which is just over here in terms of like Pakistan and Afghanistan. So there's kind of a great game empire building that's going on. In the 1990s, it turned in a different direction, more towards a resource economy. During the Maoist period, which is up until 1979, most of the economy is sort of focused on building the nation itself and less about export. But under Deng Xiaoping and the reform and opening period, which begins in the 80s, China began to look outward to become an export-oriented economy. And to drive that economy, most of it, the export and manufacturing is happening on the East Coast, but to drive that economy, they needed resources like coal, natural gas, oil, and then commodity crops like cotton. And the Uyghur lands up here, from a Chinese state perspective, were sort of underutilized and also really rich. 20% of Chinese oil and natural gas comes from this region today, and around 85% of Chinese cotton, which is around 20% of the world's supply. But to get access to those resources and to turn Uyghur lands into industrial farms, they needed infrastructure. So in the 90s, which is what this map is showing, there was a large population of Han people, the majority group, being sent to this region, often by companies or sometimes by local travel agencies or migration agencies, to build the infrastructure. And so a lot of those early, in the 90s, settlers would think about themselves as constructors, as constructing the nation. And sort of there's a kind of pioneer ethos in how they figure themselves. Initially, the work of those folks was to build the infrastructure, the pipelines, the roads, to gain access to the resources. And then as the railway was completed to Kashgar, which is the farthest point in China, farthest point west, they began to develop industrial scale agriculture in the form of cotton production and then later tomatoes. And so, part of the way this was described was as an open up the West campaign in the 90s, and then in the open up the Northwest, and then in the 2000s, open up the West. So there's a statewide campaign that centers resources on this in terms of subsidies for companies to relocate here, and free housing for migrants to settle in the region and so on. And over the course of the 90s and 2000s, what the Uyghurs experienced as a result of this was not development, which was what Open Up the West was supposed to do, not development alone, but also new forms of discrimination and poverty. Because the cost of living began to rise as this new settler population moved in, but Uyghurs were almost universally excluded from positions of power and economic wealth within the new economy. So Uyghurs were not in positions of power in the oil industry or natural gas industry. They didn't even get contracts to build stuff like railways and so on. Those all went to the settler population. And then they also saw themselves being pushed into kind of sharecropper positions with their land being seized, and their work brigade, which they were part of in the Maoist period, and then became their kind of village community center or committee, That then became kind of contracted to a corporation that was interested in growing cotton or tomatoes and things like that. And so they saw themselves losing sort of autonomy over their own land. They couldn't even decide what they would grow or who they would sell it to. Instead, it became sort of the company's land. And so Uyghurs were increasingly desperate. They saw themselves becoming that they really didn't have a future for themselves in the villages. They saw the banking system being captured by the settler population as well. And so it was hard to get loans. And then the education system also became increasingly controlled by the Han population, and Uyghur language education was first diminished and then eventually eliminated. And so it became Mandarin medium instead, and the teachers were brought in from outside of the Uyghur region. So in general, they saw their institutions being captured, which is an important element of colonization, where the institutions of a society are taken over. All of this together produces a kind of process of dispossession, in which the land in which they live and the way of life that they have is being taken from them and replaced with something else. And so what did Uyghurs do? Well, they began to move to the city. Another part of this story is that Uyghurs are also Muslim. They're one of the only, there's several Muslim groups in China. One of the only ones that has sort of title to, has ancestral homeland in which they live, and speaks their own language, a Turkic language that's related to Central Asia, the Central Asian languages like Uzbek and Kazakh. And so at the same time as like this development is happening, there's also a new sort of rhetoric that's being built in China, one that has to do with the global war on terror. The terrorism discourse entered China 1 month after September 11. That's the first time the term was used by a Chinese state worker, state authority. A spokesperson said, "We have terrorists too, it's these Uyghurs in Northwest China." And so there's a kind of a trajectory in the discursive labeling of others that's being enacted here. In the Maoist period, Uyghurs were sometimes referred to as counter-revolutionaries because they weren't going along with sort of Maoist program. Then in the 90s, they were referred to as separatists. And this actually has to do with a discourse in relation to Taiwan and Hong Kong, where there's a discussion about one China or two Chinas, or one China, two systems, and so on. And Uyghurs and Tibetans now being figured more strongly as separatists, that they want to have their own state. One of the other sources of concern for the Chinese state was that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, all of the Central Asian republics were claiming their independence, and so they were worried that the Uyghurs would claim East Turkestan again, which was something that they had had their own state in the 1930s and 40s before the People's Republic of China was established. So anyway, in what's happening though is a shift from counter-revolutionary to separatist to terrorist. What the label terrorist does though is places what could otherwise be described as someone interested in self-determination into a category of a sort of evil other, someone who is, the normal rules, the normal laws no longer apply. The civil protections that would be allotted to someone who is simply interested in autonomy are no longer granted. And of course, the separatists and counter-revolutionaries are already being dealt with harshly, but terrorism carried with it all of this sort of rhetorical and discursive weight in terms of how the US and others were treating terrorists. And there's an entire strategy of military science and how you deal with how you do counterterrorism. And one of the things that that gave even more weight to this was that in Uyghurs in Afghanistan who had gone across the border were captured by by Afghan authorities and then given over to the US, and then they ended up in Guantanamo Bay. And then there was a whole long process of trying to get them out of Guantanamo Bay. And this is an image of Uyghurs in Guantanamo Bay. And so, China is looking to this and saying, we have terrorists too, they're these Uyghurs. They also began to talk about military science that was coming out of the West in relation to the war in Iraq, which has to do with counterinsurgency theory, or COIN, and something called the Petraeus Doctrine, which is named after General Petraeus. And this has to do with how the US and its allies conducted the war in Iraq, which was around mapping the population, the entire population, to have full spectrum intelligence, and to place that population into 3 categories of insurgent, neutral, and counterinsurgent. And then as you're doing that, you begin to identify the leaders of the sort of insurgency, and you break their social network by detaining those people. And so the idea of the detainee as we know it today is really born in the Iraq occupation moment. And then there's a third process, which is about transforming the population by winning their hearts and minds. And so I'm reading the policing and military theory in Chinese, and what they're saying is that we need to adapt this with Chinese characteristics and start to use it ourselves. So this is just in the chronology of how these things come into the Chinese discourse. It's happening in the 2000s. Now, back in Xinjiang, the Uyghurs are also now starting to use internet for the first time. In 2010, which is when I was just starting my fieldwork, 3G networks arrived for the first time. And so almost all of the Uyghurs I was meeting were buying smartphones, were using a new app that was being built in China to replace Twitter and Facebook, which were now banned in China, an app called WeChat. And this app was really revolutionary for Uyghurs because it allows Uyghurs to send voice memos to each other, which maybe doesn't sound like much, but because Uyghurs many of them are not really literate in Chinese, and maybe not even fully literate in Uyghur. And in any case, Uyghur is an Arabic script, and cell phones don't allow you to write in Arabic script, at least not at this point. And so sending voice memos to each other was a way of them sort of using the technology in a way that was accessible to them. But also actually, I think they realize this to some extent, it sort of hacks the censorship system in China, because the Chinese authorities don't have the ability to track voice messages in Uyghur, or even Uyghur text, language text if it's written in Latin script, or images of Uyghur script. And so, for several years, Uyghurs were using the internet really, really widely, and in ways that the Chinese state couldn't fully control. And this allowed them to link up with sort of global piety movements, with Uyghurs living in Turkey, Uyghurs living abroad, with Uzbek teachers, because Uzbek language and Uyghur language are so close, and also to network across space. And so one of the things I was studying initially was, how do Uyghurs find their way to the city? What kind of life do they find in the city as they're escaping kind of the poverty of the countryside? And what I found was that a lot of these young Uyghurs were organizing themselves in mosque communities, in the general geographical area of a mosque, but also with particular mosques where people from particular areas of southern Xinjiang there was a higher population of them. So this is an image from 2014 of Uyghurs praying at the mosque. There's more Uyghurs than can fit inside the mosque. The Uyghurs that I was interviewing would say that this is the space of ritual Islam. It's the space where we go to pray. We might go here 5 times a day, but particularly on Fridays. But we know it's a censored space. It's controlled by the state. The imams are state employees, and their messages are censored. We know that there's cameras. You can see a camera here that's watching us. And so there's a lot we can't do at the mosque. They said the real Islam is happening on their phones. So on the phones, they're able to share messages from religious teachers who are not censored by the state. A lot of what they were interested in is just like, what does it mean to be a Muslim? What are Muslims doing in other parts of the world? They weren't necessarily focused on political struggle, political Islam, or jihad or something like that. It was a lot more innocuous than that. But that's not how the state viewed it. There's more to the counterterrorism discourse in China. We'll get back to that now. In the 2010s, there's this important moment in 2011 when Chinese migrant workers who are living abroad, working abroad in Libya, are forced to be evacuated from Libya because of the civil war. And so 35,000 people were airlifted out, or some cases they went on buses, but mostly airlifted out of Libya back to China. And like this is the first major military operation that the Chinese state has conducted in the contemporary era. And so it was major news back in China that like China is a very strong country now. It has global reach and it protects its own. And it protects its own from terrorists, because that's how Libya was framed, as this chaotic Muslim space where the Muslims are just like going crazy. And so that's an important moment. And it's one that is repeated over and over in the rhetoric, is that like counterterrorism is about preventing things from descending into Libya. Then in 2013 and 14, there's a number of attacks carried out by Uyghurs in other parts of China, not in the Uyghur region, in Beijing and Kunming, particularly one in the city of Kunming in Yunnan province, where over 30 Han migrant workers are killed by Uyghurs, Uyghur civilians. And this is described as China's 9/11, the 301. And that is what sparks officially the People's War on Terror, that Uyghurs are in the process of becoming like Libya. And then there's also the discourse around the same time of the rise of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. And there are some Uyghurs that go from Turkey to Syria. And so there's a lot of discourse around that Uyghurs are getting trained by the Islamic State, and then they're going to come back and develop, turn Xinjiang into an Islamic State. And the way we know this is because there's a kind of creeping pan-halalism. There's a whole discourse around the spread of halal products, that companies are marketing their products to Muslims. And also Uyghurs are now demanding that things that they eat be halal in a way that they weren't before. In any case, there's all this kind of Islamophobia that's just really boiling up and is now rampant throughout the general public, and is really being fostered by the state in many ways. And so there's, in addition to the People's War on Terror, which is ostensibly about stopping terrorism and violent crime, there's an additional element which is now about preventative policing, which is mirroring what's going on in North America and Europe, around something called CVE, which is what it's referred to in the US. It's something about like, if you see something, say something. And so it's about empowering or deputizing teachers to report students who they think are being radicalized. It's also about infiltrating mosque communities in the US and in Europe, and having informants. So if you think someone might be planning to join the Islamic State, like you can catch them before they go. That's how it's done in North America and Europe. And there's lots of problems with that, I think, in terms of how it can promote forms of racialization of Muslim others. But it's mostly being done within the community, and it's being done in a pretty small scale. In China, it's the same logic is being done by non-Muslims, people who don't understand what Uyghurs really want, or what Uyghur thought even is, what Islam is. And it's being done at a scale that's really unprecedented, and with a kind of data analytics component that makes it the largest domestic counterterrorism operation, countering violent extremism operation that the world has ever seen. So in May 2014, the state declared the People's War on Terror. I was there when this was happening, and I saw these posters being put up in all of the neighborhoods where they're saying that People are no longer allowed to dress in Islamic attire or have Islamic symbols on their clothing. There's rewards giving, and if you report someone who secretly has Islamic symbols in their house or something, and they're just saying like this is now illegal. Men can no longer have beards. And so that's kind of targeting cultural or religious practice. But it took a lot more than that, and it took some time for this to really develop. Already by 2014, the state security was working with private industry to start to really track the Uyghur internet, to develop new tools that would do the kind of surveillance work that they wanted. But it took some time to build those sort of algorithmic tools that would automate forms of surveillance, like looking at people's faces, automating the transcription, translation, and assessment of Uyghur speech, which by 2017 was done at scale and was now widespread in operation in Xinjiang. So initially the goal was just to break the autonomy of the Uyghur internet, that they could use it in the way that they were. But then it became more about a diagnostic tool and also about enclosure, about controlling movement. There's 1,400 tech firms working in this space. And the budget is something in the order of $100 billion that's being given to these firms. So it's a real security industrial complex that has a lot of incentives built into it for private technology companies to develop new tools through their work here. Getting access to state data, and there's a massive data collection that goes along with this, allows companies to within 2 years develop commercial applications out of their work with the state. And I reference this stuff in the books if you're interested in finding out more about exactly how profit is tied to this surveillance work. But it also takes a lot of human surveillance. So one of the things that's mentioned here is that there's 60,000 data police and 30,000 regular police that are also hired, which means that the policing density in this region is something close to the policing density of East Germany before the fall of the Berlin Wall. So what's happening with the local police is they begin to categorize Uyghurs and other Muslims into 3 categories. And this is really sort of speaking back to that counterinsurgency theory model of identifying the insurgents and the normal people and the counterinsurgents. But the way that they're framing this is really just based on sort of normative Islamic or Uyghur practice and travel history and so on. So this form, which was one of the forms that was used, has 10 categories. You start out with 100 points, and for each category that applies to you, you're deducted 10 points. And then you move into these different categories of assessment of being trustworthy, normal, or untrustworthy. So if you're an adult, then you're deducted 10 points because of your age, being a military age. Your ethnicity also counts against you. Your employment status is another reason why you can be deducted points. And many young Uyghurs are underemployed or unemployed. They don't, they're not in the wage economy, and so that means that they're unemployed. That means they're farmers. They work on the land, but that doesn't count as employment. Then there's questions that have to do with your travel history or ambition. Like, do you possess a passport? Have you visited one of 26 countries, which is mostly Muslim majority countries like Kazakhstan or Turkey? If you overstayed a visa, do you have a family member living abroad? Those all count against you. And then 5, 6, and 10 are about your religious status. Do you pray daily? Do you have religious knowledge? Which means, have you studied the Quran on your own or learn from someone who's not authorized by the state to teach about Islam? Have you studied Arabic? And back in 2014, everyone was studying the Quran on their own. Like, they were getting these pen readers that would recite the Quran for them. You can look at each page, and then they would like read them side by side, and they were learning Arabic, learning how to read the Quran. It's just like a normal part of being a Muslim. But this is now being used as a sign that this person is a terrorist or potential terrorist. And then the number 10 is, have you taught your children? Which means, have you taught them about Islam? Have you taught them about Uyghur history? Those are things that you're not allowed to do. So in this form, only two people are in the sort of normal category. So, and this one he comes in with a score of 50, which is a pretty low score. So I think if he would go one more category, he would be in the 不放心, which means that he's untrustworthy and should be detained. He's mostly okay because of his age, because he's 85 years old. So, this is like a human to human assessment. And of course, people know what the right answers are. If someone asks a Uyghur, do you have religious knowledge? Like most of them will say no, because they know that that's the right answer. But then there's other tools that were being used by these low-level police, which are these data assessment tools, which are called counterterrorism swords or counterterrorism blades. And this is just like a supplier whose contracts with the police departments. And you can see here that one of the buyers of this device is from a county in Xinjiang. What these devices do is they scan through someone's phone. They plug in using a USB cable, and then within a minute, it will give you a reading of the person's digital history, things that this person has downloaded in the past. And it will then be color coded in terms of trustworthy, normal, or untrustworthy, like red, orange or yellow and green. One of the low-level police who was using one of these devices, someone who is now in Kazakhstan and could speak about what he had done, said that a lot of times the scans would show these things that I've highlighted in yellow, that this person had unauthorized religious teachings or listened to them in the past, had been part of a religious study group on WeChat, had used a VPN, had used WhatsApp, had watched TV shows that had Muslim content or had other materials with Muslim content. So, this is like the digital diagnosis of a person's history, using the person's phone as a tracking device and diagnostic tool of his potential or her potential terrorism activity, or that history could predict that this person would become a terrorist. It's very vague. It's very sweeping. There's not really questions about what did that person use WhatsApp for or a VPN for. It's just that they did it, and so therefore they're can be detained. And once you've been labeled untrustworthy, that's a label that sticks with you. It's a negative credential that you can't really remove. It's the same way that a criminal conviction works elsewhere. But in this case, what it means is that you should be first sent to a detention center, where you're interrogated, and they determine there if your crime rises to the level of actual criminality, which means that you should be sentenced to prison as a terrorist, or something like that, or if you are like not too far gone, and therefore you can be rehabilitated, you can be re-educated, and that means that you're guilty, but only kind of medium guilty, like you have still some potential, and so they can send you to this closed concentrated education and training centers, which they built in conjunction with the detention center. This is the largest one. It's close to Urumqi. You can see from the close-up images that this is a sort of maximum to medium security prison with electric fencing, electric wires around, and razor wire around the perimeter. That there's watchtowers. That this is a prison. It's not a school in a normative sense. In mid-2018, we also started to see images like this and discussion that showed detainees being transferred using the train system. And you can, on the back of this person's their vests, you can see that it says that they're coming from Kashgar, but we've geolocated this to be hundreds of kilometers away from where these people were coming from. And in talking to the low-level workers, they said that this was normal, that this is how people were transferred, with shackles around their hands and feet and masks over their head. Very clear that this is not like a typical education environment. We also saw that there were factories being built adjacent to the camps or sometimes within the camps. And the regional development ministry said that the camps are now becoming a carrier of the economy, kind of at the level of oil and natural gas, because they're providing so many workers at very low rates for companies from Eastern China. And so companies are now relocating to Xinjiang for manufacturing purposes. A lot of what they're producing is sort of low-level commodities, things to do with the textile industry, because it's such a dominant industry in Xinjiang, but other things too, like electronics, things that don't require a lot of skill to build necessarily. And so the training that needs to go into it is not, there's less of a sort of input that's needed on the part of the factory owners. The factory owner's job is to impart quality and industrial sort of outlook to the workers, because part of the issue from their perspective, from the state's perspective, is that Uyghurs are backward, that they're uncivilized because they don't know Chinese, because they're too attached to their Muslim and Uyghur traditions, and so they need to be taught how to work. And like by working, they'll learn how to be part of the Chinese economy. One of the women who was detained in one of these camps and then sent to a factory is this woman, Golzira Alcan, who's someone I interviewed when I was in Kazakhstan. She was found guilty of watching Turkish TV shows, and she had been living in Kazakhstan. She had a passport. She was under the age of 55. She was Kazakh. She came back to China to care for her ailing mother, and then was detained sort of on her arrival, taken to a camp for about a year, and then transferred to this factory, this industrial park, along with many other people, she then realized, who had been in the camp. When she arrived in the factory, she met this man who was her boss, and she recognized him because she had seen him in the camp. He had gone sort of through the camp enclosure and had selected her. And this camp is like, it's a carceral space. It's a space where Golzira said they were only allowed to have 1 or 2 minutes per day or per visit to the bathroom, to go to the bathroom. And if they spent too long in the toilet, then the guards would beat them with either clubs or like electric stunning tools, and often hit them in the head. Initially it was an office building that was just converted into a camp, and that's why they didn't have bathroom facilities in the cell. There was cameras everywhere, including in the toilets, but in the cell it meant that they were only allowed to move when the people in the command center said they were allowed to move. So when they were allowed to go to a classroom, they could stand up, but otherwise they were supposed to sit on stools for many hours per day. There was distance learning with a screen on the wall where they're learning about sort of Xi Jinping thought, and also Chinese language. They're also memorizing and learning revolutionary songs. So they're called red songs in Chinese. She didn't really learn any Chinese. When I met her, like, I speak Chinese, and she said she didn't really know any Chinese, and like what she knew was basically those songs. So the education is really about sort of beating people and like making them submissive, less about actually imparting knowledge, it appears. What Wang Xinghua, the general manager of this company, is saying is that that the factory has generated 2,000 jobs for Uyghurs and Kazakhs. So it's a sort of poverty alleviation project, a job creation program. And it's also been very successful. It's generated $6 million in sales. Here, he's speaking to the Chinese state media in this interview. But he doesn't say that he's only paying the workers 300 yuan per month, which is 1/6 of the minimum wage. And then on top of that, a sort of piece rate of a penny and a half per pair of gloves that they're making in this factory. So he skirts around that part of it. But Golzira and another worker that was in the same factory said that this was the case, that they were paid that little. And the justification for that was that the company is also providing the housing, the security to watch them, and transportation from the dormitory where they're locked in at night to the factory, and food too. So this money, this is sort of an allowance that they can like use to spend at the company store, but it's not, they don't need a living wage because everything is being provided. Well, Golzira, was in Kazakhstan when I interviewed her, told me that there were checkpoints at the entrance of the walled-off dormitory and factory where her ID and face were scanned. She said we would have our bodies and phones checked when we arrived and in the middle of the day. We were leaving for the dormitory at the end of the day. They would check again because they were worried we might take a sewing needle. After we got to know the police contractors, we asked them, why are you still here watching us? They just laughed, never replied. The answer to this question was that the security workers were monitoring whether or not they were acting like submissive, re-educated industrial workers. Another former re-educated worker named Erbeket told me, we just had to smile and say, yes, yes. We were like pets. Now, what Golzira and Erbeket are both describing is a system of unfreedom, a system of control that prevents them from, saying yes or no to, well, saying no to what's being asked of them. They can't talk about better work conditions, about their salaries that's owed them, about their right to visit their own family. All of these things have been stripped away from them. And it seems as though it's a sort of permanent position that it's, unless someone outside intervenes, like this is the perpetual state of kind of unfreedom that these workers are being placed in. It's something between sort of prison labor and factory work. Because this is a private factory, it's not supposed to be a prison. They haven't been sentenced to work in the factory. It's not really quite prison work. But at the same time, this guy, Wang Xinghua, told Golzira that if you don't work as we're told, we'll send you back to the camp. And so they know that the threat of the camp can be held over and used to coerce these workers. Just one sort of side note is that this factory has now been sanctioned by almost all European, North American states on a prohibited list because of its use of forced labor, and other factories have as well. This is something we can talk more about in terms of how forced labor is being, or how states are trying to eliminate forced labor within supply chains in their states in compliance with their own laws. In December 2019, the governor of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region said that all of the trainees had graduated. And this was really in response to sort of global uproar about this system, about reporting that was being done by all major media, but particularly the New York Times, a report on the Xinjiang Papers, which are these sort of internal documents from Xi Jinping, from Chen Chuangguo, who's the leader of the Uyghur region, the party secretary, and a manual of how these camps are being run by the head of state security in the region, that are very damning. I mean, these papers say that they're supposed to show no mercy, that everyone who needs to be rounded up should be rounded up, that they're supposed to guard these spaces as prisons. It's very clear that the rhetoric around vocational training, that these are schools, that this is not at all accurate at this point. And so they're saying everyone has graduated. There are no more camps. We've closed them all down. But what a colleague of mine, a reporter for the Associated Press, who recently visited, told me is that, and he's reported about this in his reporting, is that this facility, and there's others as well, that what's actually happened is just simply the name of the facility has changed from Closed Concentrated Education and Training Center to Detention Center. And so there's a process in which these camps are now formalized as part of the prison system. And a worker in this facility said that what's happened is that the former students or trainees, as they were referred to before, have simply become prisoners and are now awaiting trial or are just being held in this facility indefinitely. We also know from the state's prosecutor's office in this region that more than 533,000 now, it's more like 580,000 people have been formally prosecuted in the region since 2017, which is over 500,000 people. And because prosecution rates are 99% successful in China, it's very likely that almost all of these people are in prison, like formally in prison, sentenced to prison. This is 6 times the national average if we just look at the population of Xinjiang. But if we look at the Uyghur population or the Uyghur male population, which is primarily the population targeted by prosecutions, it's much higher. It's as much as like 1 in 10, 2 in 10 Uyghur adult males are likely in prison and sentenced to prison. So there's a process of kind of warehousing of a shift towards mass incarceration that's, not unknown to us in North America in terms of how racialized minorities are treated. But of course, this is at a different scale and temporal sort of speed than in other cases in North America. But you can draw out those parallels. Another thing that's happening along with those aspects of it, the factory work and the mass incarceration, is that significant numbers of people, probably as many as 200 to 250,000 people, have been transferred from Xinjiang in assigned groups to factories across China. The people that are sent outside of Xinjiang, the Uyghur region, are typically people who are determined to be safe, which means that they're not deemed a threat, a terrorism threat. So it means they have a good family background. They probably have no immediate relative who's in detention in the camps. They maybe even speak some Chinese, but that's not always the case. And so those people are sent in batches of 50 or so to factory locations across the country. This is what that looks like. This is another state propaganda video. It's showing these workers, Muslim men being trained, and one woman here, being trained in Chinese. And you can see in the video that it's a Uyghur Chinese textbook for training Uyghurs in how to read and write in Chinese. At night, they talk about in the video that the detained workers, the assigned workers, are trained in ideology, or they're like memorizing Xi Jinping thought, or whatever the party congress has been saying most recently. This is the security detail, the police officer who accompanies them and protects the management from any potential insurgency among the workers. And of course, like, controls the movement of the workers as well. They're not allowed to leave the factories. They also send a member of the Communist Party, a Gambu, it says, to accompany them. And my sense is that these people often are in charge of the ideological education of the detainees or the workers, and also acts as sort of a translator, because a lot of these workers don't speak Chinese, but of course the Communist Party member does. And he's Kazakh, this guy. This factory is called Akbel, and it's at the time was in the Apple supply chain, building component parts, at least in some cases, for Apple products. I mean, they were supplying other people as well, other companies as well. But this is just to point out that it's very likely that your smartphone or your computer could have a component part be built by assigned workers like these folks that you just see in these images. A final component, and I know I've been talking to you for a while, I'm almost done. A final component of this, and maybe the most serious, is the treatment of children of the detainees and children in general. This is a report from the New York Times that shows that around 500,000 children in the region have been placed in boarding schools or residential schools. We also know that 90,000 new teachers, mostly from outside of the Uyghur region, have been hired. And as part of the job ads, it says that you must have no religious background, you must speak fluent Chinese, be loyal to the state, be committed to counterterrorism, all of those things. And it's quite a high salary as well for this kind of work. And so there's a kind of indoctrination campaign that's happening through the school system, and very direct parallels to the residential school systems that were used in North America to target indigenous people, as a way of sort of erasing key aspects of who those people are, the children are, and also separating them from their parents or relatives for most of their life. And so a lot of these children, I think, already probably no longer can speak Uyghur language, and are growing up, sort of detached from their Islamic identity. They are being traumatized as well. It's not as though this is like a smooth process. They understand that they've been separated from their parents. And this is the sort of generational harm that will play out for many years to come. And it's happening in these spaces. It's not only school-age children, it's also a system of nurseries, of daycare centers that are associated often with camps or each area. Chen Chuangguo, the party secretary, says that as part of this project, they're going to have 3 years of free preschool for the children. What reporters who visited these facilities see is that these are not sort of daycares. They're not places where the parents drop them off in the morning and pick them up at night. The children stay here full time. And we also see some reports of infant care centers. And we know from interviews with former detainees that there's separation of parents from their children, even while they're breastfeeding infants, that mothers are crying for their children until they're beaten and can no longer cry. So it's very violent. And I think this space of parental care for children is where you see that violence expressed in some of the deepest ways. There's also a kind of symbolic and cultural violence that's happening, which is through the demolition of mosques and the closing of mosques, particularly the small scale mosques, which are the neighborhood level mosques, which were the center of Uyghur community and Kazakh community as well up until 2017. Thousands of mosques have been destroyed, or they've been closed or converted into cultural centers. In one case, it's been turned into a bar. Sometimes the bathroom facilities or the washing facilities of a mosque, which is where you would do ritual cleansing before you pray, those are turned into public toilets. Real denigration of sacred space. This is when I was there in 2018. This is an image I took of some Han tourists, some non-Muslim tourists, posing in front of a neighborhood mosque that had had its minarets removed. And I think for them, it just was like a selfie sort of background for their Douyin, their TikTok page or something. But this is a site of harm. And here you see the camera that's still there too for tracking anyone who would go into that mosque. What I found during that visit is that spaces that were vibrant, that were full of Muslims, especially during Friday prayers, were now completely empty, that no one was going inside. And in the internal police documents that I've worked on with the Intercept, we see in one of the documents that they say that practitioners in the jurisdiction have been told that if they exceed more than 200 times in attendance in the mosque, they'll be sent to re-education, to the camp. So they're therefore afraid to go to the mosque for prayers. And this is this report is framed as a sort of success story of how you stop people from going to the mosque. They said the main reason why people are afraid is because they now have a face recognition system that will match the ID of the person and their face when they enter the mosque. And so it's every time they go, it's going to be counted. And anyway, there's a lot of really interesting primary source material, and this is actually accessible through the Intercept website. So it's something that I think could be used as a teaching tool to have students actually engage with the police documents that show how this system works and what its goals are. Another element of this is the desecration of cemeteries, which is the spaces where ancestors are buried and where Uyghurs care for the dead. And they would go regularly to give food and pray for the people that have passed on. And now those bodies have been taken away to unknown locations in some cases. And the cemeteries have been turned into parking lots or real estate development, parks and things like that. Another real serious violation of sacred space, and also one that mirrors the colonial practices elsewhere, where sacred space is targeted, sacred landscapes are targeted by colonizers. as a way of sort of asserting dominance and cutting off the roots of the native people to their place. There's a goal in doing this sort of thing. I'm really am going to wrap up here. What's being produced by this system is less about banishment to prisons or ghettos, as much as it is about building a matrix of assessment, removal, and control. And so it's not about simply warehousing populations, although that is also happening, especially to the Uyghur men that are been sentenced. But it's more about controlling the entire population of people through all of these checkpoints where they're checking people's phones and so on. And then putting them to work as they come out of the factories that are again controlled by the same surveillance system. And so one of the scholars I'm thinking about, and I'm kind of in conversation with or thinking with, is Brian Jordan Jefferson, who writes about systems of surveillance and control in North America, in Chicago and New York City, where surveillance targets Black and brown people, particularly men, but does more of the sort of banishment to ghettos and prisons, like making them stay where they're supposed to be, or moving them into prisons. So there's a slightly different dynamic that's happening in Northwest China, where it's about making a population productive, removing them from the land, but then putting them to work. So the land is also made available to the colonial system. It's important to know, though, that for the system to work in China, as it does, there's an army of unfree police checkpoints and camps that have to be put into operation. And so there's a lot of economic investment to build all of that infrastructure. And then there also has to be a workforce that you can pay to do the work. And so that makes the system not that easily portable, at least not in the way that it's being used in Xinjiang. And so there's some concern about technology being transferred to other countries, other authoritarian states, and that will we have a whole series of Xinjiangs elsewhere. And I think because of this component, it's more difficult or less likely that will happen, that there will be an exact replica. But component parts of this, a lot of the surveillance tools are already being exported elsewhere. And you see in Russia that they're checking people's phones now. They're surveilling people in filtration camps and so on, in much the same way that China is doing this to the Uyghurs. So I'll stop there, and I guess we should probably take a break, right? And then we can do some questions.
Thank you, Professor Byler. We will take that 5-minute break. And so let's see right now. We'll come back at, let's say 44 past the hour. All right, thank you. See you with Q&A. Sylvia will be reading out questions that have been put into the chat, and feel free to continue putting them in. If you wanted to raise your hand and ask your question in person, it would be great if you have your camera on. So Sylvia, please take it away.
All right, so during the presentation, we had a comment and a question from Jacqueline. I'm going to read it. She says, separately but similarly, friends of mine in Greece and Algeria who had experience with Belt and Road initiatives in their towns both said the infrastructure projects were managed by Chinese, with important Chinese getting all the best jobs, and insular communities popped up to support those workers. Basically, it was being pushed on the locals. Is that the model being followed in Xinjiang when you talk about Han migration?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good question. So I guess the answer is yes and no. What's happening with a lot of these developments in places around the world is as Jacqueline mentions, local people are often not placed in positions of power in the developments, and if they are employed, they're employed in sort of low-level sort of construction work or factory work. You see this particularly in Ethiopia, where there's a sort of a real push to build a sort of Chinese manufacturing sector with Ethiopian workers, for instance. But what a colleague of mine who's written about especially the Ethiopian context and the Belt and Road initiatives there, her name is Miriam Dreisen. You might be able to find her work. What she shows is that while there's a lot of wealth that goes to those companies that are developing the projects in non-Chinese spaces, the local people, at least in some contexts, are able to use the legal system to demand better wages, or they can sue their Chinese employers for not providing wages and so on. And the education system as well is not being captured by the Chinese workers, although we do see in some places like in Kenya and in Ethiopia that Chinese language education is now one of the most dominant electives in like the university system. But still it's not being controlled directly by the Chinese state or by Chinese settlers. And another difference is that the population in proportion to the indigenous population is much smaller. So usually the Chinese workers are, maybe several thousand or maybe 50,000 at the most, but not like 5 million as we saw in the Uyghur case. And so there's a scale difference and also a sovereignty difference. In Xinjiang, the Chinese state has full sovereignty. It can support those settlers to do whatever the state wants them to do. But in other contexts, they're competing with or have to negotiate the local governments. And because most of these states are post-colonial states, they're very leery of new forms of colonization. And instead, they're often trying to use Chinese developments to their advantage, use them in opposition to, or as a supplement to, as a rival to US or European development, to the IMF or World Bank developments that are also happening in the same space. So I guess what I'm saying is it's complicated, a little bit more complicated elsewhere. We do see forms of colonization or potential colonization. There may be the intent to colonize, but it doesn't seem as though the Chinese state really has the capacity to support a full colonization of another place. If there are any places where that could possibly happen, it's places like Cambodia, where there's really tight alliances with the government in Cambodia and the Chinese state. But it's still miles and miles away from what we see in Xinjiang, or even what we see in Hong Kong, where the Chinese state has really captured the institutions of the Hong Kong government, Hong Kong society. So I teach a whole class on this. So there's lots I could say, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Then we have a question from Christopher. Thank you, Professor Byler. I wanted to clarify, do you think the technology and digitalization of phones, the data mining, facial recognition, etc., is the new tech created as they went, or is it something that can be found in the West and being used elsewhere? Did they create their own stuff, or did they use much of what is already used? Also, are similar methods being used in other parts of China and the border?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's another really good question. And I suppose the answer again is yes and no. So a lot of this technology was born outside of China in terms of its basic capacities or its basic goals. One of the things I really point out in the book and emphasize is how one of the main companies that was doing face recognition in Xinjiang, that it got its start really in Seattle, how graduates from the University of Washington, former employees of Microsoft and then of Microsoft Research Asia, which is an incubator that's based in Beijing, how they help support both with funding and talent this company, how data sets from Microsoft and from University of Washington's Computer Science School help to train the algorithms in the initial stages. And so there's lots and lots of crossover in terms of training and also the basic technology, the basic science that goes into this technology that comes out of Western context. At the same time, like a lot of this is being adapted to the specific needs, specific desires of the Chinese state and of these China-based companies. And so you see like in the promotional literature for some of them, how they're comparing their tools to a sort of reverse engineering of tools used by the US police and military, tools like Palantir, which is something that was a company built by Peter Thiel, who is the founder of PayPal, and also on the board of, in the executive position at Facebook until very recently, or maybe still is. So there's, they were saying like, we have built Palantir here, but we're adapting it to Chinese characteristics. And so they're looking to the West for best practices. I see this in many places in the policing theory literature in China, where they say, how can we learn from what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians? What can we learn from what the Russians are doing to the Chechens? What can we learn from US counterterrorism? And so how can we adapt all of these things for our own purposes? So it's both at the level of rhetoric and strategy and science, and then at the level of technology. Another thing that is interesting is that in this Intercept data set that I've been working through, it was built using Oracle software, which is a company based now, I think, in Texas. Very influential company that is marketing very directly to police departments around the world, in Brazil, in China, many places, and thinking as though they don't have any sort of ethical, there's no sort of ethical concern that they should have for how their technologies are being used. And so part of what my work I hope does, and others that are also very concerned by this, is to show that there's complicity built into basic technology development, and that we should be training our students to be aware of the things that they're building and how they can be used and how they should be designing to protect targeted minorities, and that we should really be pumping the brakes when it comes to face recognition and data analytics and so on. And I think there's a real growing awareness of how cell phones are so invasive, how they can track our movements, our lives. Most of it is more about, in the Western context, about sort of surveillance by advertising or other kinds of services, less about state surveillance. And so the Chinese case shows how, in an authoritarian context where civil liberties are not being protected by a rule of law, that technology can really produce a dystopian state and digital enclosure that's impossible to escape. So for Uyghurs, they're living in an environment where freedom is just very, very narrow. Like, the space of agency that they have has just been narrowed down so small that the possibilities of pushing back against it are very difficult. And so I think that's what the state is trying to build, is that a system of very tight control that is still productive. It can make people work, but in terms of like autonomy or resistance, there's almost no way to do that, no way to organize it.
And is there any resistance among the average Han or intellectual to these practices?
Yes and no. Mostly no. So the Han population in China is also concerned with surveillance. They don't want companies to be able to take their data. And they are also, many are concerned about how their data is being used in relation to COVID-19 restrictions and quarantining, how they have to now carry their smartphone everywhere they go and have it scanned on demand. There's a code that everyone, basically, in order to move in China, you have to install on your phone, an app called Health Code, which allows a state worker to scan your phone and see your travel history and who you've been in contact with, if there's been any exposure to COVID in your history. And because China now has a zero COVID policy, it means that certain areas of the country are being locked down sort of for months at a time, in the sort of sequence. So you have Shanghai locked down, and Chengdu, and more recently Xinjiang has been locked down to stop the spread of COVID. It's very arbitrary, And people are very fearful of that arbitrariness, that they could be locked at any time. And so there's a kind of new discourse, especially among young people, of, and they call it POW, of trying to run to get out of the country and to travel abroad and study abroad, because right now is just, there's just so much restrictions on what's possible in terms of life. And so I think that is now, I think, making people more and more aware of things that, you know, Uyghurs and other minorities have experienced for a longer time, the possibility of a state to control you in such dramatic ways. And so that is a beginning awareness. And you also see among people that are travel abroad or have access to non-Chinese state media, a growing awareness of what's happening to the Uyghurs and a real concern around it. And, you know, some of this is like, you know, initially they thought this is like fake news or something, but the more they learned, and then the more they began to ask questions themselves of people they knew that had gone to Xinjiang, they began to realize that this is really happening. I think for many people, it felt like this couldn't be true, that we would have internment camps in contemporary China. Like, why would our state do that? It makes no sense. But then, you know, when they begin to kind of peel back the layers, they realize, oh, wow, like this is what our state is doing in our name. It says it's protecting us by doing this to these people. And so there is a growing population. I would still say it's quite small though. Like, you know, it's mostly urban elites, people that have some means, who are paying attention. Within the Uyghur region, there's also some Han people that are supportive of their Uyghur neighbors and have tried for, you know, throughout this whole time to try to protect people they knew from being interned, and try to get news out. A lot of the information we have comes from people in the region who want the world to know what's being done, and so there is that. But in general, like, we see pretty widespread support for the state, especially in relation to the restrictions on forced labor. You know, when companies like H&M or other large brands, global brands, began to relocate their supply chains, there was an organized campaign to support Xinjiang cotton, which meant that you should now boycott H&M and other stores and other brands. And so you saw like H&M lose $90 million in the space of several months from a loss of revenue, people no longer buying their products. And that's because there's popular support for what the state's saying, that you know, this is vocational training, there's no forced labor, you know, all of those things.
From Brenda, does the Chinese government, when criticized by the US or European nations for the Uyghur treatment, ever push back by pointing out these nations' activities in the era of colonialism and for the US, the westward push against indigenous peoples?
Yeah, they do this. They say this pretty frequently, that you Western nations, especially the United States, have no right to say anything to us because look at how you treated your Native Americans. Like, you put them in residential schools, you had eugenics campaigns, all of those things, which, you know, it's a kind of whataboutism sort of move, I suppose. But it's also a kind of admission that they are recognizing that what they're doing is similar to what the US has done in the past. They're just saying, because you did something terrible, we can do something terrible too. And so there's a kind of backhanded way of admitting that they are doing it. I think there's a deeper sort of issue here, which is that China and India are both sort of former colonies or semi-colonies. And you can see that there's an emergent discourse, a kind of ethno-nationalist discourse in both countries, where the kind of wound of colonialism is being activated or used as a justification for ongoing contemporary colonization in Xinjiang and in Kashmir. There's a good friend of mine, a Kashmiri British scholar named Natasha Cowell, who's written about this, comparing them very directly, Kashmir and Xinjiang. And thinking about how a colonial history, the legacy of colonization, makes people that are now in power in both states feel as though they're justified in colonizing others, and actually like colonization is a good thing for them because it shows that they're no longer victims, that they are now also global powers. And so to be a global power, you should be a colonizer. And so that's how the justification works. And so they're kind of unapologetic in some ways. Well, at the same time, if you ask a Chinese state official if they're colonizing, they would of course say no. Like, it's illegal in China to talk about Xinjiang as a colony. Like, you can be detained for it. So they both admit it and deny it at the same time. It's one of the many contradictions.
Yurika, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes, if I can, Professor Byler. I know you had mentioned towards the beginning when you showed the mosques, you had mentioned that there were government employees who have roles in the mosque. So could you speak a little bit more about that in terms of just how much is their work defined and cut out? And then one other question I had was, with the numbers and the criteria you showed us about what could get someone detained, when these happen, do families, are they taken away suddenly one day and you don't know where they were taken, what's happened? Is it, do neighbors start looking at you differently and start, worrying about the interactions they may have had with your family if you had a family member taken away? If you could speak a little bit about how does day-to-day life go on when it seems like many detentions take place?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are both really good questions. So within the mosque system, there's officially appointed imams who are trained by there's one madrasa for all of Xinjiang in the capital city. And so to be an imam at one of the mosques that are authorized to stay open, you need to be trained by the state and then given a certificate. There's monitors that come to the Friday prayers where the messages are given to people attending the mosque. And of course, like, I think my sense is that the message themselves are both the content before is like the parameters are kind of given to the imams, and then it's also like read in advance too by a state censor. So it's really pretty tightly controlled. There's variation across space, and like I can't say that it always happens this way. In general, like there are like a kind of collaborators within the state system, like in many aspects of life. And this is also a common feature in colonial systems too, that there are collaborators, people that act as translators and teachers. Many of the low-level police are Uyghur or Kazakh young men who volunteered or looked at job ads and became low-level police. Both because they didn't have jobs and also because they wanted to protect themselves and their family from being detained themselves. So there's not a kind of false choice in terms of the freedom to choose. Like, they either choose to be a police or choose to be detained, is how many people thought about it. There's 1.5 million Communist Party members in this region of 25 million people. Most of those Communist Party members are Han, but there is also many Uyghurs and Kazakhs that have been trained in Chinese and then become party members, and they also play active roles in the camps, in the policing system. But it's important to note that they're always in sort of diminished roles, that they're always subordinated to other people and they're always being watched. There's a whole aspect of the campaign where the being alert for two-faced people is something that is being talked about over and over and over again, which is, people that have divided loyalties, where they, in public say that they support the campaign, but then in private support other people, support Uyghurs, and counteract the campaign. And we know that over 10,000 local officials were prosecuted or dismissed or disciplined because of that sort of two-facedness. Many imams that were state-appointed imams were also sent to the camps. They were often the first people to be sent, and they were often talked about as wild or rogue imams who, would do the censored speeches on Fridays, but then would also like officiate other ceremonies in people's homes, would fast or encourage people to fast during Ramadan when they weren't supposed to do that. Things that are actually quite innocuous when it comes to Islamic practice, but in this context became like a sign that this person was a terrorist gang leader. That's how they're described in the state documents. So there's a complicated role for those in that kind of collaborator position, but it's one that offers them a kind of limited form of protection. And so I think we can't be too harsh on those people in regards to those people, because they're working with really limited choices. In terms of like what happens to people after someone is detained, there is a process of sort of stigmatization of the remaining family members. Often the family members are assigned a relative, which is one of these surveillance workers who comes and lives in their home. Sometimes it's for a week, 1 week per month. Sometimes it's not quite that frequent. And that person will often be taking notes and also testing the sort of religiosity, the loyalty of the remaining family members. And that means that they like bring alcohol with them and force everyone to drink alcohol. They sometimes bring pork and cook the pork for these Muslim people to teach them how to eat pork. And like, any resistance or sign of resistance to that kind of activity or invitation is a sign that this person is an extremist, that they, are secretly potentially terrorists and they can be detained. So there's that kind of intimate violence. There's part of the relatives program is called 5 Togethers, which means you should sleep together, eat together, go out together, learn together, and one other together. But like, it's really intimate. Like sleeping together means that you sleep on the same sort of raised platform. And that, especially because so many men have been taken to the camp, that the wives and mothers who are left behind are often the ones hosting these relatives. They're often men. And in some cases, there's actual sexual violence that happens in those situations. In other cases, it's sort of implied, and that also produces a kind of stigma for those women. And so I heard many reports from interviewees of women divorcing their husband who had been sent to the camp as a way of denouncing them and stopping those visits from happening. So in general, there's a kind of stigmatization. And actually that police document I showed of the 200 mosque visits, they say that one of the problems is the children are being stigmatized in the school because the other kids call them like the children of terrorists. It doesn't say that quite exactly, but that's what's implied. And then they also say that the relatives of the detainees are often not able to find jobs because no one wants to hire them. And so they're kind of in this outcast position. People don't want to be associated with them because it could impact them in some way too. That you've shown too much support, you might be a two-faced person. You should show no mercy. And so there's this whole knock-on effect of not only the people detained, but also the relatives of those detainees who are held in tension by their family member being in detention. That everyone throughout a society is affected. This is millions and millions of people.
Yes, ripple effect. Yes. Thank you, Professor Byler. Sylvia?
From Patrick, can we identify any positive consequences of Western sanctions or international pressure on this issue?
Sure. And I see there's a question from Brenda too. Which I can take next. Yeah, there are some effects for sure. So like the closing of the camps, I think is a fairly direct response to Western pressure. I think that they were building these camps for a reason. It's a lot of investment in building them. And my sense is they would have continued to detain more people if they wouldn't have decided that, oh, this is actually really harming our global reputation. not that that has like fully rectified the situation. It hasn't done that at all. But it's now, I think, gotten to the point where people in the region feel as though they're, if they haven't been detained already, that they're probably okay, as long as they sort of keep their head down, don't share information, do what they're told, they should be okay. And so there's kind of, we've entered a kind of new moment of the campaign. The people that have been taken away are still disappeared. They're still in camps, still in prison. Some of that's been normalized in terms of like the family members now receiving a formal sentence that says how long this person is supposed to be detained and what they are supposedly guilty of. And so there's a kind of a normalization of the process that's happening as a result of sanctions. The other thing that's happened, I suppose, is that it's cost these companies quite a lot of money. Most textile companies, large global textile companies, are now relocating their supply chains elsewhere, just because of the cost of continuing to operate there is just too high, both morally and economically. And so that is having an effect in terms of like kind of the global market. Many of the tech companies that benefited so much from building surveillance tools in the region are now finding it really hard to market their tools in their technology in North America and Europe, although they still, I think, have a pretty large market, and maybe the largest market in general was already in the global South, in developing nations, where because Chinese companies build it at a lower price point and have less sort of strings attached to how things are used, there's a really large market for them there. So there's been some consequences, but they're not enough to sort of redirect or change the conversation. And so I think it's maybe too soon to tell in terms of like how much pressure, what increasing pressure could do. This has really cost China quite a lot, though, in terms of its global prestige. And that's, one of the things that China is very concerned with. They're concerned with Taiwan, and they're also concerned with global prestige. And this has damaged decades of work in terms of building Chinese soft power in the world. And so that is a consequence. It's not clear what that means, though, in terms of if it's positive or not. But I think it's important to take a stand. And we are starting to do that. So that is something.
And I have a question myself, following up on this topic. Speaking of international pressure, so we know that for China, it's also a very sensitive issue to question its sovereignty, right? And it is a sensitive subject, and it can backfire when leaders of other countries question what China is doing domestically. But I was wondering if there has been, throughout the years, any pressure from religious leaders from other countries, especially top Muslim leaders, because that seems to me a channel within which you could apply some diplomacy and interceding for the Uyghur population. But I don't think I've ever heard of any pressure coming from religious leaders.
Mm-hmm. Right. I see. I already answered Brenda's question. So yes, religious leaders. So I think the Pope has said some things about this. So there's Catholic leaders that have said something, but not that forceful necessarily. When it comes to Muslim leaders, there are some Muslim leaders in the West who have said some things. Most of them are those that have been really harmed by the global war on terror. And so they're kind of political, civil leaders rather than religious leaders per se. So like former detainees in Guantanamo Bay have been pretty outspoken on this issue and condemning what China is doing. But of course, they're mostly speaking in English and to an audience that agrees with them. In terms of Muslim leaders in places like Saudi Arabia or or Egypt, like it's been pretty silent, and actually not even silent, but also supportive in the case of Saudi Arabia. This is the political leaders that are saying these things, but still, yeah, they're saying like, yeah, we have, radicals here too, and we crack down on them. China's doing the same. It's fine. Pakistan says the same. But I think in those cases, like really at the end of the day, what's motivating that is a concern and an interest in Chinese trade and political relations. China is a really large economy, particularly in the developing world. Many Muslim nations are in the developing world. And so keeping good relations with China is just really important to the national economy, and they're not going to compromise that. Also, many of these nations, Muslim majority nations, are not necessarily supportive of human rights in their own countries. They don't see the UN as their ally necessarily, and so they're fine with working with China. If you talk though to like kind of everyday folks in, the common citizens in places like Indonesia or Malaysia or Bangladesh, you see a really different view. You see street protests in support of Uyghur rights. Palestinians as well are quite supportive of Uyghurs. So I think there's a real disconnect from the kind of the leadership structure of Muslim majority states and the general population. And I know this isn't quite the same as like religious leaders, but I think religious leaders are often dealing with their political context where they're based, and that likely has some effect in terms of how much they're willing to do or say. They might just see this as sort of outside of their purview, but I don't know what their justifications are. They should be doing more.
And there's a question that someone asked in the sign-up forum, and it's so they were asking you for a prediction about the next 10 months. However, I wonder if maybe for, especially thinking about the scope of what China is doing, you can maybe make a prediction, just your opinion, of course, for the next 10 years.
In terms of, in relation to what's happening to the Uyghurs, or more generally?
No, just to, in relation to the Xinjiang topic.
Well, I think, so a lot of what happens in China operates along 5-year or 10-year plans. And so they talk about the campaign as being a 5-year plan. I think some of that is kind of done retrospectively, that they've now, because they've moved on from the camps, say that part of the campaign is over. They have replaced the party secretary who was in place when the camps were built, Chen Chuangbo. The new guy is Ma Xingrui, who's a technocrat from Guangdong province, and he talks about sort of normalizing the economy while still remaining vigilant when it comes to counterterrorism, still tracking people's movement and speech. So kind of a normalization, but of the counterterrorism campaign, but also a return to normal when it comes to economic activity. And one of the things he's emphasizing as well is that Xinjiang is really well positioned to develop artificial intelligence. I think because the tech sector is now so strong in the region, which is another way that you can think about the economy of security industrial complex building into something else, which is not unlike how Seattle and Silicon Valley and Urbana-Champaign, Chicago got their start in relation to computing in support of US military and government stuff. So it's not as though this is completely unique to China. But in terms of 10 years from now, I think they see this as a generational campaign, that because the systems are so they can kind of run themselves, and they have this workforce of overseers who are benefiting or are coerced into working the system, that the people that are being placed in these factories can continue to work and will continue to work. They'll be sort of held there indefinitely. And if the Western nations won't buy those products, they'll just orient them towards the domestic economy or towards nations that don't care about the use of forced labor. When it comes to the children, I think that is the population they see as the future, those that will be more fully assimilated, that they're a malleable population. They got them when they were young, and so they'll be trained to sort of forget about important aspects of their Uyghur difference, because they'll be trained in Chinese and think in Chinese and so on. I think they're not thinking though about the trauma that accompanies this, and how the history of colonization shows us that residential schools don't necessarily have the effect that they're intended to have, and that many people emerge from them really damaged. And so I think it's kind of too soon to tell in terms of what the outcome will be for these children, but not, I think, as successful as the state thinks. They're also moving many more Han people into the Uyghur region. The land of the people that have been detained is now becoming the land of those new settlers. And so I think we'll see an acceleration of the settler colonialism that I outlined in my talk. So that seems to be the future, which is pretty dark one. Yeah, it's a normalization of violence, and it's not clear how you extract people from it. I think only thing we can do is continue to place pressure on them and continue to notice that this is happening.
And Christopher was just asking a question that you just partially answered, but which was, as China used a similar campaign tactics in Tibet and other areas, have those places been effectively neutralized presently? In your opinion, is that the goal, some sort of watering down, dispersing of the population and take over to the point that resistance effectively disappears, or is there other long-term goals?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, China is using similar tactics in Tibet. They haven't used camps to the same extent. There have been some camps there, but it's not at scale anywhere comparable to what has happened in Xinjiang. They also have an assigned labor program that's sent many Tibetan people to work in different places. But it doesn't appear to be nearly as securitized or as coercive. People can say no to it, or they can leave if they don't like the assigned work. There's surveillance that's really similar, and very similar tools that can track Tibetan language, just as they're able to track Uyghur language. And some of that is about dispersing the population. The Tibetan population in Tibet itself is much smaller than the Uyghur population. It's just it's a couple million people, which is, it's still a lot, but it's not 12 million. And it's not an urban population, whereas the Uyghur population is primarily urban. Or, I mean, they're farmers, but they live in villages and around urban areas, whereas because Tibetans are historically nomads, there's a greater dispersal of people. And so I think for those reasons, they're seen as a little less threatening, just in terms of their numbers. And then also because they're not Muslim, they're also seen as less prone to violence relative to Uyghurs, less connected to kind of a global Muslim world, or, and the threat of terrorism and so on. They do use the rhetoric of terrorism to talk about Tibetans that self-immolate, monks that burn themselves as terrorists, because they're, I guess, frighten people that see it. But it's not in the same register or with the same level of threat as they are in relation to Uyghurs. And people are actually really afraid of Uyghurs. Han settlers that I met when I was living there would talk about how brave they felt to go into a Uyghur majority area where people, they could see people staring at them and stuff. So there's a different kind of fear factor. But yeah, I think the goal is actually fairly similar, to disperse the population, to assimilate them using the education system to train the next generation in Chinese, and then also to move settlers into the ancestral lands of these peoples, and make it part of China. that seems to be the primary goal, about centralizing power and also moving people and infrastructure west and into international areas. Xinjiang in particular is seen as a sort of core region of the Belt and Road leading into Pakistan and Central Asia. And that, I think, is the actual future, like 10 years, but maybe 20 years down the road of building Chinese infrastructure and sending population into those places.
And there was a comment from Alice that said, the Archbishop of Canterbury has made a statement about the Uyghurs. Several years ago, he organized a group of leaders of various religions in the UK, and they wrote a statement warning about a Uyghur genocide. I remember reading it, but I don't remember when, a few years ago.
That sounds right. I think that there is real concern around this among some religious leaders, among a whole range of different groups, and some of them speaking from really different historical vantage points or perspectives, as to why they care. So Muslim Americans, Muslims in diaspora, they care about this because of the global war on terror, and they see the linkages and have experienced forms of the racialization of their own faith. So some of the best readers of my work are young graduate students and students in India who are thinking about ethno-nationalism there and anti-Muslim racism that they've experienced, and how similar, but also in some ways different it is from what's happening in China. And then the Jewish population in North America, so a number of Jewish advocacy groups and others are also really concerned with this because they see, a camp system that reminds them of their own history in experiences of camps. And then, people that have experienced the Soviet systems, they also see real similarities, the Gulag system that they experienced in some cases, and just forms of really intense surveillance, human surveillance, the criminalization of basic behavior, that all makes sense to them. This novel that I translated, The Backstreets, is a really sort of Kafkaesque novel. It's sort of written in dialogue with Camus and Kafka and other sort of modernist writers, but it's thinking kind of from an anti-colonial perspective about what it's like to live in a hostile city in relation to the institutions of the settler society. And the author Perhat Tursun is a really close friend of mine, someone I knew really well when I lived in the region, and who really wanted me to translate this book. And then in 2018, he was detained and sentenced a year later to 16 years in prison. And my co-translator, we did it together. He also disappeared into the camps. And so, the stories that I'm thinking about in this book is really politicized and is connected to the politics of what I'm talking about in general. But it's out there in the world, and people are reading it and picking up on the resonances in the text of this novel to novels that have spoken to other crises that they've experienced or that have happened in world history. So I think that there's those kind of connections that can be made in a number of different spaces.
Thank you so much, Professor Byler. We are getting kind of close to time. I think there was one other question, so I'll ask if Maria would like to stay and ask. But thank you very much, Professor Byler, for such an informative 2 hours in explaining the complexities and the nuances of what is happening in Xinjiang. And thank you also to Sylvia for managing questions and running the Zoom. And thank you, everyone, teachers, I know it's getting quite late on the East Coast. Thank you for spending the last 2 hours with us. And next week, we'll have Professor Robert Pekkanen speak about Japan. So we hope we'll see you then. Would you be able to stay a little bit for another question, Professor Byler?
Sure, happy to.
Thank you.
Great. So if anyone else has a couple more minutes to stay, of course, you're welcome to. So Maria was asking, I'm aware of being out of time, but how do the Chinese reconcile what they are doing to the minority groups in Xinjiang and what they did to save the Jewish people during World War II?
Mhm. That's a good question. So I suppose they're in a different position in some ways. So, during World War II, when people were able to flee through China and through the Soviet Union was at war with Germany. And so I think, so helping Jewish folks at that point was, a way of supporting sort of a socialist cause in some ways, or just an anti-Nazi one. And so I think we have to understand that it's not necessarily they're operating out of sort of goodwill alone, although there might have been some of that. There's also kind of a political strategy that is part of this too. But yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I'm sure we could, it's a way of also talking historically and comparatively about how things like this can get justified or not. I mean, I know one of the ways that Chinese folks in China reacted to the first news about this, that it's similar to the Holocaust, was with disbelief. Like, that couldn't be true. Like, how could this happen again? And also, like, our country is a good country, it would never do this. And so I think, like, trying to come to terms with that is something that is important and really requires providing that evidence, and then helping people to sort of sit with it. And this is a good analogy, a way of bringing that together, is to talk about how China treated Jewish people during World War II in such a different way.
And if you do have 1 minute more, or just briefly, could you, I just lost the question. Could you talk more about the transition from tech and surveillance moving to AI, and who were in the US?
Who and where in the US? So a lot of these tools really kind of came on board in the mid 2010s. That's when there was a number of breakthroughs in machine learning, especially when it comes to computer vision, artificial intelligence, which is, the ability of computers to recognize patterns in images first, and then in video after they've done the images, and also voice recognition systems, the automated translation systems. That is part of real breakthroughs in algorithmic science. And so a lot of this technology is really new, and I think initially there was a thought that, like, it's exciting, it's new, what could go wrong? Let's just do whatever, let's just build stuff. And not really thinking about how these things could be used to harm marginalized people, both unintentionally and also intentionally, when it comes to, like, an authoritarian state. So one of the things we've seen is how a lot of this tech is being adapted by states, by policing systems, and how it accelerates and makes it more efficient, the work that police already do. But as it's doing that, it's further sort of cementing forms of bias, structural racism that's already built into policing. So a lot of what this tech does is it just sort of builds on top of existing problems, even as it's sort of presenting itself as a solution. And so, right now, one of my colleagues who we're writing stuff together, she's looking at how a private prison company based in Colorado that contracts with ICE, with immigration in the US, has now placed over 200,000 people in forms of digital arrest as an alternative to arrest. These are asylum seekers who come to the US to seek asylum. And because, like, we don't have camp facilities for them, and also it's said to be more humane to not put them in camps. We now instead give them this private prison tracking device on their phone, which allows an ICE agent to track their movements and their communications from their phone. They must keep their phone in at all times, and also record scans of their face on a regular basis to show that it's really them. But it has all kinds of implications that aren't readily apparent, which is that like everyone who's associated with that person is also stigmatized by it, is also really concerned. And because many undocumented people in the US are their support system is also other undocumented people, it means that they're isolated and alienated by the system. So anyway, that's just to say that like we see these things developing in the US in democratic contexts, while in a parallel to how they're developing in authoritarian places. And in both cases, they're producing negative outcomes for marginalized people, just at different scales, but not really a difference in kind. So, that's sort of the history of this. In terms of like who and where in the US, I mean, there's 200,000 or so machine learning technologists in North America and Europe. So there's many, many people that are doing this kind of thing, not all like directly connected to China, but there's just so many different places that nodes of this that's happening. And at this point, there's not a lot of pushback to it. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to raise more awareness. And that's what I and other colleagues are trying to do is to talk to computer scientists, talk to machine learning technicians, and help them to think about the implications of what they're building, even though they think it's very many steps removed from them. It has direct effects on people's lives.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much for answering all of these questions, Professor Byler. Thank you again. I think we will end the program now. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Professor Byler. Thank you, Sylvia. Good night, and we hope to see you again next week.
Thank you so much. It's great to meet you all.
Thank you, Darren.